Good evening to everybody and welcome to today's event. It's a great pleasure to have you all this evening. And I welcome you all on behalf of the Peninsula Foundation and South Forum. Jointly, we've organized this event. Today is interactive lectures, and thereafter you all can interact. You will also be able to raise your questions through the chat mode, and it's also live on Facebook. And those of you who are sending in messages, we will get that here and we'll be able to. Yeah. Today's topic is a very, very interesting and important one in the current times that we live in, and particularly at a time when the US presidential elections is underway, and I believe it actually demonstrates that democracy is alive and kicking well. And, and the topic today for us is diversity, federalism, and democracy in India, a Southern perspective. And this topic will be undertaken by our guest speaker today, Professor Ganesh Devi, who also heads this South Forum. Professor Devi is a very, very accomplished and well-known, academic and an activist across the world, known across the world and in India. Professor Devi was educated at Shivaji University, Kolhapur, and the University of Leeds, UK. Among his many academic achievements, he held fellowships at Leeds University and Yale University, and has been the THV Simons Fellow from 91-92 and the Jawaharlal Nehru Fellow in 94 to 96. He was a professor of English at the Maharaja Sayaji Rao University of Baroda from 1980 to 1996. In 1996, he gave up his academic career in order to uh, uh, in order to initiate work with the denotified and nomadic tribes and Adivasis. During this work, he created the Bhasha Research and Publication Center at Baroda, the Adivasis Academy at Tejgarh, the Denotified Tribes Rights Action Group, and several other initiatives. Later, he initiated the largest ever survey of languages in history, carried out with the help of nearly 3,000 volunteers and published in 50 multilingual volumes. Professor Devi has received several Lifetime Achievement Awards. He was awarded the Padma Shri in 2014 in recognition of his work with denotified and nomadic tribes and endangered languages. He was awarded the Sahitya Academy Award in 1993 for a book After Amnesia, and the SARC Writers Foundation Award in 2001 for his work with denotified tribals. He was given the Prince Claus Award in 2003 for his work and for the conservation of tribal arts and craft. His Marathi book, Vanaprast, received 8 awards, including the Durga Bhagwat Memorial Award and the Maharashtra Foundation Award. In 2011, the Lingua Pax Prize for his work for the preservation of linguistic diversity. He writes in English, Marathi, and Gujarati, and has published 95 books, including the PLSI volumes, in areas as diverse as literature, linguistics, anthropology, education, and philosophy. Today's topic will deal with the most important issue of language, diversity, and that relates to the inherent strength of India, the diversity that exists in this country, and an attempt at homogenizing everything into one single framework endangers the multiple cultures and the rich heritage that India and Indian regions have. So his lecture will present a comprehensive view of the language diversity in India and detail how the idea of diversity was embedded in the freedom struggle and is enshrined in the Constitution of India. It will highlight the need for safeguarding diversity as laid down in the Constitution and how diversity has been of a focal importance in the edifice of Indian democracy. The social, cultural, and linguistic diversity has been at the heart of India's federal structure. This lecture will point to the lapses in safeguarding federalism and diversity. To give you a little orientation, I think we need to be aware that as a modern state, as we came into 1947, uh, the freedom struggle and Congress in particular worked towards recognizing the linguistic diversity of India. And that decision was taken when Gandhi took over the movement in 1920 in the Congress, Central Committee meeting. It followed subsequently, and Nehru endorsed it, Patel endorsed it. However, in 1948, the kind of problems that we had in partition and a whole lot of other areas, this reorganization of states was put in abeyance, and it was revived when Andhra struggles, emerged in 1952-53, and we had the most important milestone event of reorganization of states on linguistic basis in 1956. That decision was taken by Jawaharlal Nehru. And next week is the 134th birthday of India's first Prime Minister, Jawaharlal Nehru, on November 14th. We also coincide this lecture as a dedication to his memory. And I invite Professor Devi to come and take the floor and go ahead with this lecture. Professor Devi.
Air Marshal Dr. Mateswar, thank you so much for your kind words. Thank you also for asking me to speak at the Peninsula Foundation jointly with South Forum. It's really very humbling for me to be amidst so many legendary scholars and thinkers who are present today. I will present before you some broad brush trajectories, narratives related to diversity, federalism, and democracy. Probably after I have spoken, if there is discussion, I will feel enriched by the discussion. I begin by alluding to a book written by a political scientist, Japanese American political scientist, Fukuyama, in 1992. That book had a very enigmatic title. It was called The End of History. This book came soon after the collapse of the Berlin Wall, which at one time Dr. Chakravarti and I visited together. The world had become unilateral, or was imminently becoming so. And at such a turning point in history, it was difficult to visualize what the near future would be, let alone what the distant future of man would be. Fukuyama took the position, not accepted immediately by his contemporaries and historians and political scientists, position that having won so many battles in the long history for freedom, for liberal state, for a state that cares for its citizens, humans probably may not want to do anything further, want to do anything more and go further. And they might end up producing only banalities. But Fukuyama also added another thesis, and that was that in such a situation, probably there might be a revival of the primitive barbaric tendencies, or at least atavism, and a strong infantile desire to go back to the past, which humans have crossed over way back in history, and bring that idea of the past to bear upon the present in the most absurd manner. This Fukuyama had presented 30 years ago. It is true that in a world that became unilateral, and more than that, a world that became hugely capitalistic, the aspirations of people all over the world, and particularly in the South, the southern world, the poor world, the world where wants still haunt large populations, new aspirations, new orientations had to take possession of the mind of the people. So these 30 years have been a time both of doubt and some kind of uncertain hope. Now I'll turn to this uncertain hope or uncertain prediction of the future. The old binaries have gone. That is true. Socialism versus capitalism, Marx versus Adam Smith, USSR versus USA. That's a thing of the past, I admit. But some kind of uneasy binary dominates our imagination of the future today. And I'll describe this binary. There is on one side the idea that what we glibly or generally call development might continue forever, unstopped, ceaselessly. The root of that idea is in the thoughts of a Russian astronaut who, in an international discussion, proposed that development could be measured not in terms of height of people of a given nation or their calorie intake or the number of gas cylinders or two-wheelers they have or four-wheelers they have, but rather in terms of access to energy. This was a simple idea. It worked. It caught the fancy of those working in the area of development experts, and that idea got acceptance. Once that idea came to be accepted, a rather bizarre idea that had come in the field of mathematics based on some science fiction of 1930s, but the idea that came up in mathematics was of 1960 brand, started attracting the minds of those who are into mathematical modeling. The 1960 idea in mathematics was proposed by Freeman Dyson. Dyson's idea was that if humans could build a kind of a shell around the earth, high above the surface of the earth, several million kilometers above the surface of the earth, and if this shell could be opened and shut by using triggers within the control of humans, it would be possible to trap all the energy that the sun is capable of giving to the earth. And then that energy could be rechanneled, used, and life of humans could be made easier with 1 trillion times greater access to energy. I found this idea a science fiction idea when I first heard about it, read about it. But 2 years back, some of the scientists working in the USA actually spotted a distant star and claimed that intelligence on that star shows signs of creation of such a shell, which is shut and open, and therefore the twinkling of the star had very large range of variation, which is unusual for a star. One idea of development which spreads out before humans, the dream of a ceaseless growth, unlimited increase in the speed of movements, unrestricted mobility, and therefore completely unhampered production of all the things that humans need, and therefore an immense and limitless scope for consumption of what humans like to consume. One, on the other side, there is the idea of the Anthropocene. I think it was about 18 months ago, maybe 16 months ago, that scientists got together in London and confidently, somewhat officially, formally announced that humans have crossed at least 7 out of the 10 tipping points that they had narrated, described, accepted as tipping points. It does not matter if it is 7 or 8 or 6 or 10. The point they made was humans have entered a new era, a new cosmic era, a new era for the earth, not just for one nation or one people or one community, a new era for the earth. And in that era, the human footprint on the earth, the resources of the earth, is bound to remain always too large and irreversible. And therefore, whether slowly or rapidly, the end is the annihilation of species. This has happened sometime in the past, distant past, through climate change. One is aware of that. But this time round, the rate of annihilation, the speed with which humans are getting rid, causing damage to species, getting rid of the diversity, that speed is unparalleled, unprecedented, and therefore the story could possibly come to an end fairly quickly, far more quickly than we imagine. This is the other idea of the future before us. One does not know if one or the other of these two ideas are a real possibility, as we say in India, of the future that is laid out for us before us. But what is true is there is need for a caution. And that caution is, if at all we want humans to progress, if at all we want the human advent to continue, if at all we want the fruits of development to reach as many as possible, then we need to slow down the decline in diversity. We need to stop the perishing of diverse species and diverse cultures. Shall we succeed in doing that? I do not know. But it is certainly true for us that if we did not think of these two very opposite futures, a utopian and a dystopian future, and somehow balance our ways so that we do not go to the worst, even if we do not get the best, probably we might be able to leave some future for the generations to come and not plunder all of it here and now, even before the future generations are born. Now, this is where the question of diversity comes in. The question of diversity is important not just because UNESCO has said that languages are dying, not just because environmentalists or botanists have been telling us that the botanical species, plant species and animal species are declining. It is important for us as a political philosophy in today's times. And we actually see that the politics as it is unfolding in Europe as well as in our own country is getting segregated, getting polarized in terms of green politics and the right politics. The elections to European elections last year indicated that in ample degree. We have to poise ourselves democratically between these two extremes that are laid out before us by scientists and those who understand these areas of concern. One of the features of diversity is language. Language is what makes humans human. Language makes us distinct from other animal species. Language, being the foundation of thought, is also of a crucial importance for all our philosophies, science, and therefore our ability to control our resources, nature, and conserve and preserve the human species itself. Without language, those won't be possible for us. And therefore, language is important, and language diversity even more important. There was a time in the 18th century when European linguists believed that all languages in the world have emerged from one single language. And the story of the Tower of Babel dominated the imagination of linguists. But researchers have shown over the last 2 centuries that that has not been the case, that languages have developed indigenously in all continents and have crisscrossed their paths to produce new languages, and therefore creating, and perpetuating many linguistic diversities. In India, the diversity of languages is traditionally accepted warmly, positively, and not as a blemish on culture, but as a cultural grace, as a cultural gift, a cultural ornament. I can give you many examples. For instance, the 4th century grammarian, philosopher, Panini, 4th century BC, before Christ, Panini, did not construct the grammar of a single language called Sanskrit. He rather looked at all the languages that he could look at, languages that existed in his times, and came up with a framework which could become grammar of a language. And within that framework, he examined a certain variety of Sanskrit, which then became, after centuries, a standardized Sanskrit. The point is that Panini was aware of the existence of many languages in the country. But this is only the 4th before Christ. If we go a few centuries even before, prior to Panini, we have Gautam Buddha speaking to his audiences in many varieties associated with the Pali language. And at the same time, we have his contemporary Mahavira, who was operating within a language universe that we described as Prakrit. And yet, somewhere on the western front of India, northwestern front of India, there was the incoming Sanskrit. So we have Sanskrit, Pali, Prakrit coexisting and equally competent to bear, to hold high philosophical thought, high metaphysics, and great social relevance in their own times. If I move ahead in time and go to, let's say, the 7th century, there are theorists who have described a number of ritis, a number of linguistic styles, linguistic presences in the Sanskrit universe of knowledge. In the Tamil universe of knowledge, the very foundational text, Tolkappiyam, speaks of at least 4 different languages. Very clearly, the language spoken in the north, Tolkappiyam says, is very different from the language spoken here. And the language spoken in further south is quite distinct from the language spoken here and the language spoken up in the north. These are the Tolkappiyar statements about the linguistic diversity in his time, if there was a Tolkappiyar, because we know the text Tolkappiyam, but we do not know enough about its author. The Mahabharata was composed in many languages and pulled together, brought together to fit into a single language matrix. The fact is, throughout the history of India, Indians lived with many languages. They lived with many languages comfortably. They allowed the linguistic exchange, arrival of new languages. They welcomed. They preserved old languages and also developed new languages in their own places, own spaces. There was no constraint as far as scripts were concerned. In Karnataka, the script that Tulu used was being used by Kannada at one time. And today, the script that Kannada developed as its own script is being used for Tulu language. Sanskrit itself was written in so many scripts. In Kashmir, in Kerala, Sanskrit was being written in two different scripts, and yet it remained a single language. Over the last 1,000 years, modern Indian languages grew in different parts of the country. They emerged and developed rapidly. They developed very rich literature. After printing came to India, that growth even multiplied, increased. It got accentuated. Wherever the English language reached elsewhere in the world, it managed to kill the local languages. But in the case of India, the arrival of the English language actually helped the growth of the languages that we describe as regional languages. But I'll not get into that story. During the freedom struggle, the leaders of our country were very mindful of the diversity of languages as a cultural necessity, as a uniting bond of India. The language diversity is seen as a common feature, whether in the Northeast or in the South or in West India. And therefore, in the 20s, when the Congress started dreaming of having an independent India, a resolution was passed in one of the Congress sessions, probably 1926 or 27, that the free India will be a multilingual India. And indeed, when the making of the Constitution began, when the Constituent Assembly it started functioning, even if the members of the Constituent Assembly quarreled over the question of language from the very second meeting, the first meeting was a welcome meeting, from the very second meeting to the very last meeting, as to whether it should be English or Hindi or which should be national language, none of them, absolutely none of them, suggested that we should have only one national language. They accepted the existence of so many languages. Of course, the 8th schedule of the Indian Constitution accepted only 14 languages at that time, and later 4 more were added, and yet another, and 3 more, and now we've got 22 languages as scheduled languages, while the census of India shows a much larger number of languages as being present in the country. That's true, that the schedule to the Constitution did not admit all the languages, and yet one must say that the very heart of the Constitution articulated the idea of Indian federation in terms of language diversity. There is an intimate connection between the idea of India, which is a union of states, and the 8th schedule meant for languages. I will spend a few minutes on this interconnectivity between the idea of federation and diversity, particularly language diversity in India. The states that were made in India were created not because they were given to us as states. We all know that there were so many princely states to be merged with the Union of India, to be made one with India, to be put within the fold of the unitary India. And yet, irrespective of the administrative districts that the colonial government had handed over to us, in 1955, the government of India decided to appoint a linguistic reorganization of the states. And it was not just the language as the backbone of the state that actually encapsulated, that symbolized, that word as a metaphor for the eco-cultural zones, for historical traditions, for the amity between people, communities. There were so many invisible, so many intangible elements in that metaphor, language, which appears simple, but in the case of India, a very complex, different kind of metaphor. And so from 56 to 64 or 65, different states were created as linguistic states. Had the constitution indicated India purely as a unitary nation with concession made to different different districts, administrative districts, the arrangement would have been different. But those who had participated in the making of the constitution and also came at the helm of affairs in independent India, particularly Jawaharlal Nehru, saw the need of respecting language diversity as the foundational principle of federalism in the country. It is not spelled out in the constitution in these words, but in the historical process, the actions that crystallize go to indicate that language diversity is a backbone to our federalism in the country. Democracy can breathe if it has the federal space in this country. It gets suffocated if federalism comes under attack. Whenever in the past there have been brief moments of such an attack on the federal structure, whenever there have been attempts to minimize the importance of the states and the state chief ministers, we've seen how Indians feel suffocated in the universe of democracy that they have inherited as part of their personality and thought. It is true that federalism has many other tangible aspects. For instance, the accounting of the taxes that the state send to the center and the center gives to the state. Or another is the shared list, the joint list, the union list and the state list and the joint list, concurrent list. That is another main plank of our federalism. Yet language diversity is, and it remains and will remain, a very important central feature of Indian federalism. Now I come to the present. In the present, there has been an attempt at imposing the Hindi language on the southern states and on Bengal and on the northeastern states, and there have been predictably sharp reactions. The logic in bringing Hindi, a language, the newest among the Indo-Aryan languages, the most recent to have arrived on the scene. Hindi, a language yoked together with the idea of Hindu, and therefore Hindustan is a deeply flawed logic. Let me say why it is so flawed as logic itself. We do not have any precise beginning of what we call the Hindu religion, if it is a religion in the sense Christianity or Islam are religions. We even do not have a very clear idea about the times before the most sacred text of the Sanatani Aryan Hindu period, the Vedas. There is a huge element of uncertainty, doubt, and impossibility of arriving at any conclusion about the period preceding the Vedas. There is a clear historical chronological gap between the end of the Indus Valley civilization, which is dated at least for now between 2600 or 2500, the early part, to before Christ, to about 1800 or 1900 before Christ. The Vedas, as all linguistic evidence, archaeological evidence, and evidence related to the arrivals of the wheeled carts, used as a military vehicle for throwing arrows at enemies, shooting arrows at enemies with speed. I mean, there's a wonderful book, The Horse, the Wheel and Language, David Anthony. This book describes the history of about last 6,000 years of language development in various parts of the country, and how languages spread from one to another area, one continent to another continent, because of the technology of the wheel and the cart and the horse coming together as a vehicle for wars. I'll not get into that. But there is a clear gap between the people of the Harappa or Mohenjo-daro and the people who were developing the Vedic literature. And we do not know what preceded. There are claims that people from the south went to the Indus Valley, but those claims are also not fully, conclusively accepted. There are big holes in those arguments. But in short, one can say that India has many beginnings, and one among them, Indian civilization has many beginnings. One among them is the Vedas. Another is, let's say, this Indus Valley civilization, about which we do not know enough as yet. There is yet another beginning preceding the Indus Valley civilization. That is the beginning of the agriculture in the country, particularly rice cultivation, because that precedes the Indus Valley civilization at least by 2,000 to 3,000 years. And there is yet another beginning going to the paintings in the caves, on the rocks of the caves in the country. Dr. Chakravarti will tell us more about it. We have so many beginnings, and where Indian people are at ease with the idea of having so many beginnings. But the Hindi, Hindu, Hindustani conjecture challenges the idea of many beginnings. In the idea of many beginnings, there is space for the South. But in the idea of Hindi, Hindu, Hindustani, the space for the South is entirely denied. Denied is the ancestry of the Proto-Tamil, the presence of the Proto-Tamil. Denied is the history of ancient Kannada going back to the times before Christ. Denied is the fact that so many arts, music, musical instruments, dance, dance styles, literary styles, so many words in languages that Indo-Aryan languages accepted emerge in the South. Denied is the fact that cultivation started first in the South. Denied is the fact that historically the human stock, if it came from out of Africa to Andaman, from Andaman to the South, there are debates about this, but the human stock first populated South India and then moved north. All of this is denied in that myopic vision of who the people of India are. Denied is the fact that India has always lived in diversity as a normal condition. Denied is the fact that the backbone of Indian federalism is language diversity. Denied is the fact that India has accepted through blood and sweat, through sacrifice, through struggle, through lot of thought, the democratic model of the state. The South has to rethink how we can reclaim the eroding democracy, how we can strengthen federalism by emphasizing the Southern identity, not for division, not for secession, but for strengthening India as the South's contribution to India. The South has to rethink what diversity means for India's existence, diversity that the South has preserved even today. I am not proposing that the Indian people who do not live in the South are fundamentally or radically different. I am merely proposing that a political philosophy which has had some run in other parts of the world as well over the last 8 or 10 years and a good run in this country needs to be challenged by bringing to fore the idea of democracy, federalism, and the idea of diversity. And the most powerful manner in which the South can bring these three ideas to the foreground them in the larger national discourse, the main way of doing it is by speaking about our languages and their dignity, their contribution, and their history. And if we do that, we are not erring in the eyes of our constitution. All of us, citizens of India, have equal right, freedom to claim our languages as our languages. The South needs to speak in a single voice. The South is normally reduced to a second in politics, in the national politics, a subsequent in the national economy, a slightly inferior in the arena of the political strength, because in the South we are divided. If we are united, we are the largest minority in the country. If we are united, we are the largest repository of diversity, both of plant species, of sea life, and of languages as well. I think we need to rethink where we stand in relation to democracy, federalism, and diversity in the interest of this great country, great civilization, which has had a life continuous, which has now 135 crore population, and which is the country of the future for the rest of the world. It is for us to come together and think closely, carefully, and in a concerted way so that we can make a difference. Thank you so much.
Thank you. It's been an excellent exposition and wonderfully put across. Let me invite everybody to raise their questions or their points of view. You can raise your hands and comment on that. Before that, let me ask, some of the important points that Professor Devi pointed out. The language is the marker of identity, culture, and history for any community and any group of people living in a particular land. And at some point of time, like you said, you've repeatedly stressed on that issue of Hindi and Hindustani is a way of outsiders representing or seeing the Indian subcontinent with the limited knowledge that they had to call what this land was in terms of, and of course, when you go back into history, it's linked to the Indus River, and that's how the whole process evolved. But to translate that into a national identity is a deeply flawed, process. And I think we need to move away, and most of the Asian countries have grappled with this problem as well, is the legacy or the understanding of Westphalian nation-state system, which tends to now look at the concept that a nation state must have a single language and a single culture. That's been problematic in history all through, and that's what continuously since our independence has animated our discussions and problems. So like you said, the languages have to be very, very clearly recognized as a strength of the country, and the diversity is extremely important. So in that context, the way the current, environment stresses on rewriting history, and you brought that out very beautifully. There are multiple, origins to how India evolved. India has been a melting pot. There have been how languages evolved is all, the history is a continuous process of research that needs to carry on. We need to give more time for science and a scientific temper rather than trying to homogenize the whole process and recreate an artificial history, which will probably lead to a decay and death of many subcultures that actually is the strength of this country. So what do you feel? How do you feel now? What would be your, ideas in the context of this approach, which has actually also been, a problem from the Constituent Assembly days onwards, when, Rajendra Prasad used his, oath to actually declare Hindi as an official language. And that process has all that led to the problem that we face today.
Well, when we look at the census reports for the last 50 or 60 years, we find that Hindi shown as swelling by bringing under its rubric so many non-Hindi languages. To give some examples, all the 42 languages in Rajasthan are put under Hindi today. In the last census, 2011, the statistics of which became available to us in only 2018, and is obviously doctored. The languages of Chhattisgarh are shown as Hindi. Languages of Himachal Pradesh, all Uttarakhand, they're shown as Hindi. Uttarakhand has Kumaoni and Gadwali as major groups, and within that, Kumaoni has 6 and Gadwali has 8 sub-languages, but they're shown as Hindi. Then in Bihar, I mean, today we are having elections in Bihar, Maithili. Maithili is an ancient language. I mean, Maithili is as ancient as Kannada is, shown as part of Hindi. Now that's mind-boggling. The result is I mean, the reason is, of course, the nation, the government in the center will have to show Hindi is growing, because if it shows that Hindi is not growing the same way as Bangla is growing, or Telugu for that matter, there would be difficult political questions to face. And the growing poverty in the Hindi land, Hindi speaking language, UP particularly, and Madhya Pradesh, this increase in Hindi becomes a cosmetic, as some kind of satisfying story for the young people who are without employment. Hey guys, we are growing. We are culturally growing, even if we are not having jobs for you. I think this kind of daydreaming about Hindi is unrealistic. 5 crore 20 lakhs are shown. Indians have gone out to claim that Bhojpuri is their mother tongue. But those 5 crore 20 lakhs are put within Hindi to show that Hindi is spoken by 48 crores. If we take away all those chips, I mean slices, then what remains is just about 32 crores. And that's, Bangla is not too far behind, or Telugu is not too far behind Hindi. I think the greatness of India as a multilingual country should be used as capital to attract modern industry, modern investment, modern societies, because to be multilingual is and is even without saying a word about ourselves, is a great indication of being democratic. We don't need any other certificate for in order to be seen as democratic. To be multilingual is to be seen as democratic. Many voices. I think the myopic view of history, this narrow view of who we are, what Hinduism is, without understanding what it is, that's hurting us. It is hurting the constitution, but it's also hurting the South in many ways, which might leave on the South long-lasting, undesirable effects. And those we need to, even this committee on culture that the central government has appointed, the South must immediately oppose it. Kumaraswamy spoke up, Kanimozi also spoke about it, spoke against it. In the month of September, in the parliament, the culture minister said, we appointed a committee to look at 12,000 years history of India. But why the heck? It's not necessary. Indians do not want to look at that history as a history with a single beginning. The beauty of India is to be able to live with many beginnings, with many gods, many religions, many languages. The manyness of India is Indianness of India. That's my view.
Absolutely, absolutely. And if, you mentioned about the languages and the origins of Tamil, and particularly the Tolkappiyam. But if you go into the earliest Sangam literature, there's one of them called Pattinapalai, which describes Kaveri Pumbatinan was a great poet, and it actually brings out the entire process of trading. India was a great maritime trading, particularly great trading nation, and much of the products flowed from north, from the Gangetic Valley into the south, to move away through the southern ports to both east and west, to the Roman world as well as to the Southeast Asian countries. And that is very extremely beautifully described. Now, it brings out the existence of varieties of languages, varieties of cultures, different peoples, but all of them were able to interact without any differences or animosity between different groups of people. You've done an enormous amount of work on tribal places. One of my visits to Nagaland, you get to know that there are about 36 odd tribes, and they are grouped into 6 or 7 groups. And each of the tribe has a language which is completely distinct and different from the other tribes. And those form into 6 groups, and those groups actually now have a common lingua franca, which for their security, they make sure that tribes have a separate language. And the interaction between the groups, the common groups from security from the other groups, they have a common language as well. And when you actually interact and discover with this kind of existence of such rich heritage, and the country is focused on homogenizing into one single language, I think very soon we may actually end up losing our heritage and history in this entire process. With your work, do you think any effort has been made in, at least treasuring and retrieving some of these capabilities and heritage?
Well, Dr. Chakravarti has done enormous amount of work. In my own little way, I documented all languages of the country with the help of a large team, almost 2,000 to 3,000 persons. With Nagaland, the Tainadi has 18 distinct languages. Nagamis is the common, is the common bridge for all of them. But even in absence of Nagamis, they were communicating among themselves. War is a kind of a communication. Unless there is a shared language, a war is not possible. Completely mutually unintelligible enemies is not a full definition of enemies. I mean, you know it better than I do. But yes, of course, the people, ordinary people in the country are conserving the diversity. They're speaking, even if they have no jobs, they're speaking their languages. Even if they do not have the wherewithals, they're somehow preserving their own paintings, their own knowledge about vanaspatis, herbs and medicines and so on. The Hakki Pikkis in your part of the the bird catchers, when they understand so much about birds that a Salim Ali would actually happily award them an honorary doctorate if he knew who the Hakki Pikkis or these Fase Pardis are. They know practically everything about birds that humans know about birds, about fish. Now, of course, because the Modi government in Gujarat sold the sea to Adani, the small fishermen have started suffering, and therefore our knowledge about fish has gone down. In so many languages we documented, I noticed that the words for fish have the people are forgetting because the small fishermen are endangered. They are pushed inland, and as you said, Dr. Mateshwaran, India has historical memory, but it's not only about Punjab and Kashmir and Khyber Pass. It's also about the coastal connection with the rest of the world. India was connected through sea or through sea as well, and that memory is peculiarly southern memory, and that's negated in school, in political and social and cultural space in the country. Indians think of themselves as if they are a landlocked country, whereas your foundation is doing a wonderful job in calling itself the Peninsular Foundation. We have to think of ourselves more realistically, geopolitically also. But I think probably Dr. Chakravarti might be able to comment on this far more competently because he's so much learned about. He made diversity as his life's mission, despite being an IAS officer. He refused to become secretary to Government of India when he was asked. He went after diversity and conservation. If he's still there, I will.
Yeah. Shall I?
Yeah, please
Well,
come, sir.
Dr. Devi and I have worked for decades together. I mean, my contention is a bit different. And since I have dealt with government all my life, in this particular dispensation, what I find is that there is a new language. It is a language of doublespeak, doublethink, fraud, and utter deceit. I mean, this kind of language I have never heard before. I mean, where you say something, you mean something else, you do something else. There is a deep split between the letter and the spirit and the execution of law. So this is, I mean, the language which is taking over the country. And the second is the radical rift between technology and ecology. You see what Dr. Devi was talking about, the knowledge systems, I mean, which are there all over in micronuclear, you see, niches. I mean, in 100 different ways, they have notched their language. Yet underlying all that diversity, there is this deep sense of a simmering connection between nature and culture, interdependence of organic and inorganic communities, human and non-human communities, which is the language of the country, and which expresses itself in diverse ways. I mean, which has been expressed and articulated in Dr. Devi's volumes, all those volumes. I mean, he has brought out the nomenclatures, the terms of differentiation, categories, classification, etc. So that language is being killed. The third is that substitution of the big for the small. You make a big statue and you destroy all other statues in the country. You make a bullet train, you destroy the transport in the country. You talk about Hinduism, you destroy Hinduism in the country, do nothing for Hinduism. You talk about, you see, what shall I say, mega developmental corporate development and ruin everything, I mean, on the ground. You talk about, you see, things like, you see, what, environment and diversity, and then you talk about Rama along with it, and you destroy the entire itinerary of Rama. I mean, going through, you see, this entire Chhattisgarh and through south, the entire itinerary of Rama is being destroyed by Adani's and Ambani's. And that is being carefully steered. And so it is all, and then the biggest thing is, you see, this monoculture of the mind. I mean, there is no intention to do anything for Hinduism. I mean, I have been dealing with monuments and sites and heritage all my life. I mean, never in history has there been such a diminution and decline in funding for heritage and monuments and culture. So the culture of development is not a culture of song and dance. I mean, the Ministry of Culture should have coordinated for culture of resource management, culture of human resource management, culture of medicine, culture of food, culture of irrigation. All that they do is to stage spectacles in Delhi. I mean, for inviting one or two, you know, I mean, what shall I say? I mean, lackeys here and there, either in the religious domain or in some other domain. And then they do a celebration. Now, this society of spectacle, as I call it all the time, driven by consciousness industry and by a media, and then fed by a large group of lackeys in different areas. Biggest, you see, criminals are our tribe. I mean, who have fallen in line like never before. I mean, sometimes, I mean, there is saber rattling and swashbuckling statements from the top army brass, whereas there is no preparedness. I mean, there is a complete lack of preparedness, and there is all the talk, bluster. In the same way, in every area, whether it is, you know, digital India or smart India or stand-up India, sit down India, clean India, one is only talking about India. Where is Bharat? Bharat is completely missing. So that's why it comes out in the words. That, I mean, the monoculture of the mind begins at the top. And then, so what is happening is, according to me, that the loss of diversity, I mean, is now a kind of a clear and present danger, unlike ever before. Even if the earlier governments did nothing much for preserving diversity, they did not do anything in an engineered and organized manner to destroy it. Now there is a complete, I mean, organized attempt to destroy it systematically. And so you substitute words for action. And since most of us, I mean, who live in the cities, or, you know, we live in clover and whose children are abroad. I mean, and whose so the middle class is has a vested interest. So it knows nothing about the ground. Most of our IS officers do not. I mean, many do, but many of them do not even see the hinterland communities. So they just travel to large urban complexes. But there are others who are outstanding, but their voice is obviously suppressed. So I am talking about concrete things. I mean, which so there is a substitution of a language of complete, deception for a language of diverse, articulations, and that has to be understood. I mean, in order to deal with the media, in order to deal with the court, in order to deal with all the institutional structures of government which have been degraded and disgraced and I mean downgraded in so many ways. All the universities, wherever you go, I mean, people of no account. I mean, people who can't even, I mean, stand up in an international gathering. I mean, they're there. And the people who are meant, I mean, to serve as scientists and, I mean, this country has enormous human resource, whether here or abroad. Outstanding human beings are there. And who can, I mean, upgrade any institution without any remuneration, without any love for lucre. But a systematic, the language of fraud and the language of deceit requires that you downgrade the human resource. You only fill all the institutions with, junk and garbage. So my view, I mean, is that this is the language which is being substituted as for everything else. And the South has, I mean, when I go to let us say the Ramakrishna Mission, I see two ladies, sitting there. I mean, ladies of high breeding and enormous sophistication, selling, dhoop. I mean, and they're earning something for the temple. And there are people with deep love for tradition. I go to, a small village, and there is an enormous temple. In the north, you will all the temples are doing, and then the government doesn't look after them. There is no person there, and the country has billion monuments and sites. Only about 20,000 are protected between the states and the. Now here, the villager and his family, they go and clean up the temple. There are about 70, 80 villages which are connected with the temple. That is still alive. Now that is what is called tradition. That is what is called Hinduism. That is what is called the real, spirit of the nation. So that it is this confederal association of hinterland communities which are deeply committed to the tradition and to the so-called Hindustan or Hinduism or Hindi. And Hinduism doesn't mean, I mean a Hindu. It means the entire nation with all its diversity, with all its capability. So it is that which I think is endangered, and what Dr. Devi has been doing all this life. I mean, facing all kinds of dangers, and there are people like him who have been with him, about 3,000 of them. I mean, humble people. I mean, who expect nothing except to do the work. There are such people all over the country. So the human resource and the intellectual resource, the moral resource, I mean, which is being degraded and destroyed, I mean, in an institutionalized manner. Corruption was at a personal level. I have dealt with corruption always at a personal level. But when corruption is institutionalized and dished out in a very systematic manner, and then you ensure that all dissent is suffocated and that the democracy is destroyed forever. I mean, either through different, degrading the different machineries, send out the election commissioner to Singapore or to Taiwan or some such place, and degrade his children, harass them, things like that. So this is what I have dealt with all my life, and I have an impression that what Dr. Devi has spoken about is really this. He has talked about the complete decimation of the language of discourse, the language of gentlemanliness, the language that the hinterland communities speak, the language of complete grace and dignity. I mean, a poor man has greater dignity than this bunch of thugs. So, that language of discourse is being completely decimated by a language of doublespeak, double think, and this is not our culture at all. This is neither Hindi culture, nor Hindu culture, nor Indian culture. This is a culture of gangsterism, and a culture of, what shall I say, the dregs of society.
Thank you.
Absolutely. I think you've said it very. Go ahead, sir. Go ahead.
No, together we will reverse this assault. So we will counter this assault if we are together. Thank you.
We are together.
There are a couple of people who raised their hands, 3 of them. Let me invite Mr. Vagishan. You can go ahead with unmute your mic. I can ask your question.
Thank you so much. Am I audible?
Yes, yes. Go ahead.
Thank you so much, sir. Thank you so much for the Peninsular Forum, as well as the doyens sitting there. Sir, how should we tackle with this when English? I believe English today is an Indian language also, but then how should we tackle that a kind of dichotomy which created between a regional language and English, and people, especially from the Bahujan front, believing that regional languages are fundamentally debilitating and English is enabling? In such a context, how should we deal with this? It may be a little bit tangentially going out of our discussion, but then this is one question I just wanted to ask Professor Devi. And to Professor Chakrabarti,
Yeah.
how should we deal with preserving our diversity in such a situation of double speak? What is your POA? What kind of, because as I bow to you, because all your life you have been thinking about diversity and all that. So what is the POA for people to preserve diversity?
Well, I mean, you see, community co-directed efforts have to be, universalized. Now, look at the education policy. I studied it. Now, in fact, there was somebody from the United States who even asked me whether I could designate some people who could be on the committee. I mean, who would not be fabulists and who would also write good English, and who would also, write good English about good Hinduism. So I said that I can't think of this combination. I mean, who will not be fabulous and will, so I don't think I can make any suggestions. But then I read the policy. There is so much discussion about sustainable development. I mean, sustainable, if you read the education policy, you will see that it only talks about sustainable development. Now they understand nothing about sustainability. And the educational structure, it has no capability. So unless you build the capability, and if you are degrading the educational institutions, how do you build, all this human capital? So the human capital is out there in the entire country. But they look at the skill development program. I mean, I am also associated with a university, which is a skills university. I have been telling them that you are giving a machine learning. The machine learning, takes people to a few corporate industries in a few enclaves. Now, unless you go back to some of those ideas like Gandhiji's, you see, interdependent village republics, and then developing local employment based on a local resource. Now, if the government doesn't do anything about it, then it is very important that the entire civil society, I mean, whatever Dr. Devi is doing with his, groups, every day he's having his meetings. I am also trying to do the same thing with Janjati Darpan here. Indranil is here, I think. So that, from developing an idea, then we intervene. What else can one do? And this is not a permanent, durable thing. I'm sure that it will have its day, and its days will be numbered. But then we must hasten that process. And that process can be hastened only by community co-directed action. And that is what Dr. Devi does. That is what people assembled here do. And I am also here with them.
Well, about the English language, Dr. Ambedkar has a very good stand.
Hmm.
And we do not have the right to stop people from learning English if they find that English is the means to better life for them. We do not have the right to stop them, because they will say, look, your children all studied English and now you stop us. It's exactly the same kind of argument with that the southern countries, the economically southern countries, have in relation to the carbon emission. There is an ethical issue. But as someone who studied languages, I can assure you, sir, that when any given language grows beyond its carrying capacity, it starts cracking up. The best example is of the Sanskrit language itself. The Sanskrit declined, but the Prakrits survived. And Marathi, Bangla, Assamese, Kashmiri, they all, and Oriya, they come up, while Sanskrit was trying to dominate.
Sanskrit was never a common man's language. That's one of the reasons, no?
Yes, but it was quite widespread at one time in history because of the patronage. It was not common man's language, just as English is not common man's language and will not become common man's language, because Indians have the innate ability to live in several languages at the same time. I mean, I studied English, but and at home sometimes we use English. That's true. Many of us who migrated to other cities or married across caste, religion, states do use English. And yet I find that many who use English end up writing books in their own languages. There have been many examples. My very eminent friend, who is no more, U.R. Ananthamurthy, was professor of English, but he wrote in Kannada. Mahashweta Devi used to teach English in Calcutta, but she wrote in Bangla. I taught English literature, and I decided one day that I will start writing in Marathi and Gujarati, and I wrote books in Marathi and Gujarati. Indranil Acharya, whose name Dr. Chakravarti mentioned, teaches English in Bengal, but he is working with tribal languages. We Indians love languages. We are people who feel comfortable in the presence of many languages. A simple example, and then I'll stop. When we travel in England and speak our languages among Indians, if there's a group of Indians, the English become immediately conscious of somebody speaking some different language. But in India, if we're in Bombay or Calcutta or Chennai or wherever we are, and many other languages are being spoken around us, we do not become so conscious of other languages being other languages. The idea of the other as distinct from the self in the Indian psyche is poised, is positioned differently. The swa and the para relationship, the ego and the external world, or chitta and the vishwa relationship, they're differently positioned in the Indian way of thinking. And that's what makes us Indian. And therefore, even if some people decide to consciously study English, no harm done to our languages at all. Let them study English. They will also speak our languages, or somebody else will, some other people come there and continue the language, Amazon or Ganga or Kaveri or whatever, the river of language continues. The individual fish might migrate to other rivers, but the rivers don't dry up in India. Among the top 30 languages of the world, there are 8 Indian languages, and all these 8 Indian languages are languages with the longest history. They're longest continuous languages among those 30 languages spoken by largest number of people in the world. Therefore, I'm not worried about this. And English is like an overarching sky. It's not going to fall on our heads. Uh, I think the danger for some of the Indian languages today is from Hindi and not from English, and that we should recognize.
Thank you.
Absolutely, excellent. So I think that also answers Mr. Giridhar Rao's point, quite similar point that he had raised. Let me invite Satya Sivarao. He's raised his hand. You can unmute yourself and ask your questions, please.
Thank you very much, Professor Devi, for a very wonderful lecture, very educative, and raising this very important point about diversity, which is at the heart of the democratic process. I just wanted to make a couple of points quickly,
Okay.
response if possible. One is that the threat to diversity or the process of homogenization is something that is probably very ancient and driven quite a lot by technology. For example, you mentioned about the spread of languages in the past, say even with Sanskrit and with the horse and the chariot and the wheel. So in the modern period, I wanted to get your response on what you think of the homogenization that is coming through these two big factors, not political per se, but one is technology, the spread of technology. Today, we are all using very similar technologies, whether it's Facebook, WhatsApp, Google, or we are buying our goods through at least the urban populations, and it's only spreading. So there is a loss of diversity that is happening due to the spread of technology, same technology dominating across the globe, in fact. Second is the movement of money and capital, which tries to consolidate and monopolize. I mean, if you look at the concentration of wealth in India or around the world, I think it's unprecedented. Even in the times of emperors, this kind of concentration probably was not there. So the establishment of monopoly in economies isn't that a threat to diversity? And I think that some of the attempts at monopolizing culture, language, political power in which we are witnessing is a reflection of what's happening in the world of business and particularly the operation of large corporations. The second point I wanted to make is that I'm a Tamilian was brought up in Madhya Pradesh. So quite familiar with the politics of central India and Uttar Pradesh and so on. But I've always felt that this whole Hindustan is a proxy for imposing the cultural, social, hierarchical priorities of Uttar Pradesh on the rest of India. So in that sense, it's that narrows, that Gangetic Plain, I don't want to refer to it as entire Gangetic Plain, but particularly Uttar Pradesh. And one of the reasons for that, I think, is since independence, Uttar Pradesh has been the politically most important state in India because anybody who dominates Uttar Pradesh dominates India. So you have politicians, not just from UP, but from other parts of India, deliberately playing up to the vanity of the people dominant in UP, typically upper caste Hindus. So they push this Hindi, Hindustan, Ram Temple. These are all priorities of a very small number of people in UP. But their priorities are being exaggerated and to win UP and bring UP under control by the national political party, whether it was a Congress in the past or the BJP currently. And using the model, the cultural model of UP, which is Hindu Hindustan, as the model to spread across India. Of course, it will not work because of all the other reasons that you mentioned, that there's going to be a lot of resistance from the rest of India. But I think that the problem is not just of the south of India in that sense. It's the problem today, I think, is faced by all states of India which are not Uttar Pradesh. You know, the problem, the Kashmiri shares the same problem as the person from Kerala, and from Manipur to Gujarat is probably a bit of a different case for one simple reason, that while the people of UP are pushed in front as a front of the BJP. The fact of the matter is that in terms of the money being made, in terms of accumulation of capital, it's all happening in the western part of India, between Bombay and Ahmedabad. And I think that one has to see, if you take, while Uttar Pradesh dominates electorally, the actual people of Uttar Pradesh get virtually nothing. It's one of the most poor, backward states in India. A few politicians make money, they come to Delhi and become ministers or even prime ministers. But the people of UP get nothing. So there's a big kind of fraud perpetrated even on the ordinary people of UP. So I think a discussion on diversity, if we can talk about role of capital and technology at one level, and in the Indian political context, how to deal with Uttar Pradesh, I personally have always felt that it should be divided into 4 states to reduce the tremendous amount of electoral clout it has currently. Thanks. I just wanted your opinion on that.
Yeah. Professor Devi, go ahead. Professor Devi?
Yes. Thank you for raising the question of technology. The assault of artificial memory, and that is surveillance by artificial intelligence dependent on artificial memory, AM, it's hurting culture everywhere for the following reasons. The artificial memory is self-sure about itself, whereas the human memory tries to explore the past and imagines a remote past beyond its own reach, and therefore generates myth about that past beyond its own reach. That's what the human memory does. The artificial memory has no memory of itself. It does not understand the past, and therefore is not capable of generating myth. It generates fantasy. The next thing is, dreams are, as Freud has told us famously, are actually a gathering, a reassemblage of bits of memory lying in the unconscious, natural memory lying in the unconscious. The artificial memory is incapable of having dreams. And democracy is all a business of humans having dreams, not dreams in sleep, but dreams for the future. And it is the assault of technology on culture is precisely impoverishing the humans of their sense of the past and the sense of the future, and making them marooned in the present as perpetual consumers for a never tomorrow kind of life, and therefore plundering, exploiting everything. So absolutely right there. That's actually hurting diversity in a big way. As far as the capital question is concerned, and the Gujarat UP relation nexus in that,
Go ahead.
yeah, the UP has those many parliamentary seats in the Lok Sabha, but all these states south of the Vindhyas put together have more seats in the parliament than UP has. And that's a point that we have never made in Indian politics in the past, openly, clearly. There's one more thing. If we developed a refined argument about federalism, then we notice that Nagaland, which was mentioned earlier, and Kashmir, which they have also suffered at the hands of this centrist, unitary kind of dictatorial regime. So many states will come on board on the question of federalism that they will have an overwhelming majority over this unitarist kind of view of politics. And that's the only way for Indian democracy to remain alive in future. And therefore, diversity is as important. Federalism is equally important for us. As far as the question of capital is concerned, I was in Gujarat. I spent 35 years there. During the years when Modi Shah duo emerged in politics there, and later migrated to the national politics. And I studied every bit, every brick by brick, rock by rock, the building up of the Gujarat, the so-called Gujarat model. And all of it is based on a fraud. Every time I noticed, whether it was, small banks scandal in Gujarat, or whether it was the owning the cricket game, or a transfer of land to Tatas for the car factory after after Mamta refused to give land. It was given cost free with a gift of 10,000 crores as soft loan for 10 years without interest free loan, or handing over the entire coastal area to Adani. All of it was fraud on the people whose votes were used for coming to power, and allowing the crony capitals to grow. So it was really stealing from the state. These are strong words, but it was a deception on the state. And that model is taken to the national level. The people in UP have remained poor and becoming poorer by the day. You're absolutely right. And the people in UP do not wish India to suffer democratically or federally. The people in UP do not think that Ram temple is going to solve all their problems. They may be Ram Bhaktas. People in UP want bread, they want jobs, they want education. And breaking up UP could be one solution. But much before that, we will have to do everything that is possible for us within the framework of non-violence and constitutional means to get rid of the present regime, and then we can move to a better arrangement of the federal structure. Thank you.
Absolutely. And what you said about UP is absolutely correct. I've lived in Eastern UP for quite some time in Gorakhpur. That's where the current chief minister comes from. And one of the most backward regions. And I think a real development needs a much different, more focused approach. Let me invite Soni Salman. She's waiting to ask her question. Go ahead, ma'am.
Hello, sir. Johar. So I'm Soni. I'm speaking from Odisha. So I'm a tribal girl, and I think till maybe 3 years, I always identified myself as Adivasi. But then I think when very recently I came back to Odisha, to my hometown, I realized that this is my tribe. I belong to the Konth community. And, the sense that I'm a Adivasi is actually breaking now. And I'm thinking that I actually belong to this community and there are more communities. So although I think it's very, very beautiful that we have so many languages and, we move from this place to that place. And even in I live in the fringe of Odisha and Andhra. So here, I speak in Telugu, Odia, my language, English, Hindi. It's actually very, very beautiful. But I also think that it, there is a very nasty side to it as well. When people actually try to own a language or, try to own an identity. Because so when I was in college, I was doing my master's in IIT. I was working to develop or digitize a script for the Sora language so that people can type, on phones, on desktops, and all these digital devices. And I think till I was in college and I was working, I was very separated from the community and I was working. It was going really well because I was so like inside a room working with my professor, getting guided. It was easy, in fact. But when I'm coming here and I'm working, I think languages are very, very difficult to work with. I mean, so what is happening with this particular tribe is that there are tribes who have converted to Christianism. So, I mean, Christianity. So, what happens is when you tell them that this is your script, they feel that I'm trying to divide them because now they're using English or they're using Latin script as, like as a medium to read Bible. So when you're telling them that this is your script, they feel that their community will be divided. Recently, I was in a panel discussion with, like professors from Harvard, Odia people, and I was told that, like you would rather use Odia or you would use Telugu. Why would you bring another script into existence? I mean, just because we are 5 lakhs, don't we have any identity? Like, is so I feel really sad that the minority does not have that strong representation because I don't think we matter to people politically. I mean, I feel that it's like it's the majority which matters. It's the people who make money that matters. It's the people. I mean, although we do, I feel although we do give so much, like all our mines are from our place, like 30 kilometers from my house is where all the mining happens. All these mines go to everywhere in the world. And because we do not represent in population, I feel that we have to listen to all of this. I feel that, like, I mean, we are not accepted in the 8th schedule. We have to fight for it because we are not a majority. I mean, it does sound like a rant, but it is, I mean, I'm speaking with an angst which I really cannot like put in really sweet or nice words. I really want to know, like, I mean, what do we do? I mean, should not there be a handshake between, like people who think, I mean, people who are minority and people who are majority? Does there need to be a fight always? I mean, like, we are not asking for a separate country. We are not asking for a separate state. All we are asking is to be accepted, a language to be accepted. Is it so difficult? I mean, is it so difficult for the government to support us monetarily to make books in our language? I i think it's very funny. I don't think so. I mean, like, I it's a funny state is what I feel
Yes,
like.
Soni Sharmaji, your agony I can fully understand. I spent nearly 20 years working with Adivasis and fighting for the language rights of Adivasis. The meaning of democracy, where even the smallest minorities care for, where the concerns of cultural acquisitions of the smallest minority are respected, not just tolerated, but respected. And that's where the advanced democracies are moving. And that should be the idea of the future for democracy. I mentioned at the beginning of my lecture this End of History, the book End of History, how people will start producing only banality. But only if we have a dream of the future will democracy remain alive. The democratic processes, the advent of the man, the human spirit will remain alive. And that forward path should be protection of all diversities. When you have 5 lakh speaking Sauras, the Mundas are larger in number. But if you went to Sabar, just a little north of, they are only about 80,000. And there are Asurs who are now left only in 3 talukas. There are people in Andaman having languages where the number of speakers is 10 or 15 or 20. Even they must be respected in democracy. That's when democracy will become a true democracy. In order to do that, all of us have to come together. You are not alone. There are others fighting for tribal languages and rights in Rajasthan, in Gujarat, in Himachal Pradesh, Uttarakhand. I'll be very happy to put you in touch with all of them. Tribals today number nearly 12 crores. The nomadic and denotified and semi-nomadic communities are approximately the same number. These are distinct from tribals. And these 25 crore persons is not a small minority. It's just that we are separated, we are divided, we'll have to come together. The scheduled castes found a very great leader such as Periyar or Ambedkar. The tribals have still not found a great leader. Unfortunately, Abhay Kaka was coming up, died in his early 30s, last year. That was very sad. And Ramdayal Munda is no more with us. But even if we go for a collective leadership, we must strive. I think it is then that, Saura is at least 1400-year-old in its history. I published an entire book of Saura stories for Sahitya Academy in 1999. Mahendra Kumar Mishra had compiled that. 1400-year-old
I
language
have your email ID. Can you please
cannot
send
be
it?
wished away, cannot be trashed. The state has no right to do that. The education department has no right to do that. We must all stand up and fight. Even if one is alone, this fight must continue. And in the end, we will win. Thank you.
Absolutely.
I
Dignity recognition for identity is extremely important. Yeah, go ahead.
I wanted to am I allowed to reply to a message which was in the chat box?
Oh, yes, go ahead.
So I think
Let me read out the chat box messages for both Professor Devi, and then you can probably give your comments.
yes,
One is from Selvin SJ. It is unfortunate that the number determines Indian democracy rather than the members who are diverse. If democracy discusses majoritarianism, such kind of amalgamation of people and their languages under one category will continue to destroy the existence of diversity. Aiming at uniformity is a curse to the society. Majoritarianism is a tyranny, actually. So democracy is not majoritarianism, and that's the essence of American Constitution, in fact. Second one is from Gopal Karakodi. I always have severe difficulties with majoritarianism as the voice of the people. John Rawls, neither Kenneth Arrow agree with the existence of majoritarianism as an indicator of social justice to all. Value for diversity should have been the basis for a federal system. And Parvati Purnima has a question for Professor Devi. How do we deal with challenges of linguistic hatred, particularly in the context of recent concerns related to language, skill test, and job reservations in the interest of locals in certain South Indian states, while realizing South Indian identity as a project of strengthening federalism? Sonia, you can comment, and then I'll request Professor Devi to take on.
yes. So I think someone has mentioned that having a script or not having a script does not really matter. And like what matters is the boli, like how we speak. Yes, there is some amount of truth to it that, how we speak or how we transfer our knowledge through speech is important because we tell stories, and that's how I remember what my grandmother told me, or like she has never written anything to me. But I also feel that like script is really, really important. If there were no scripts, I think we would have definitely forgotten what the Vedas told us, or
Okay, I will offer two thoughts for you to think about. One is Saura is spoken by 20 times more people than Sanskrit is spoken according to the Census of India 2011, 2001 to 1991. Sanskrit is claimed by 24,000, Saura by 5 lakhs. So please go and tell the Saura people that you are 20 times larger in number than the speakers of Sanskrit in this country. and therefore you have equal claim on this country as the Sanskrit speakers have.
Yes,
The
definitely.
second thought that I want to leave, for you is, the English language in its history set up. I mean, the British set up a committee to translate the Bible into English, and so the King's version came up, and in beautiful English. Beautiful English. I mean, that's the Bible that we read now. I read that Bible, the King's version. But the English, in their entire history, never set up a committee to create a script for the English language. You know that the English language does not have, even today, a script of its own. It is using the Roman script that the
Yeah.
Latin language. So do not worry too much about the script. What matters is whether a language has knowledge in it, imagination, literary works, and even more important is whether a language can provide jobs to the people who speak that language. Then only people continue to speak a language. People speak the language where they get jobs, livelihood. So creating livelihood support for the speakers of a language is the best way to keep a language alive. There are mighty languages without any literature, and still they are spoken by a large number of people. Anyway, I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Devi. It's been an excellent evening, but I think we have to bring this the time is running out. But before I request Professor Devi for his concluding remarks, and then request Professor Kalam to do the conclusion, is there anyone else wants to raise any points?
Yeah, sir, can I?
Yeah, Ian, go ahead.
Yeah, hello, distinguished panelists. It's a wonderful discussion indeed. I have very brief points to raise. Firstly, we're talking about this imposition of Hindi, Hindu, and Hindutva. Of course, they are like related, but there's another thing we must we must remember that language cannot be imposed all the ways. There are people also love and want to learn for several reasons. For example, for Hindi, Bollywood is a tremendous thing that has actually provoked many other peoples to inclusivity of the Bollywood, one of the thing. Secondly, among the Muslim communities across, even in the southern state like Tamil Nadu, the Muslims almost are familiar with the tongue of Hindi. And there are a couple of other aspects. And there is a requirement of a bridge language. I know a politician who was invested in English media press because he wants a bridge language. Because dialectically, diction-wise, and syntax, phonetics, linguistically, English is not that much comfortable to the native other speakers. I think English is 44th language spoken in India, but it's holds a huge, massive economy. Which language has money? It has the people. So similarly,
Short, please.
Sir?
Make your comment short so that we can.
Yeah. So I'm saying like the BJP, where there's an upsurge of saffron afterwards is there. So with this, I'm saying the party's manifestos and everything, neither of their pamphlets are like writing or emphasizing on local language on their political manifestos or the pamphlets. So how do you feel, what should be the bridge language of India? And yeah, if I'm allowed to, just one point I also need to make. There is a time, it's Dainik Jagaran from India that claimed the world's largest circulated Hindi daily. And similarly, Times of India is one of the world's largest English daily. It's no more, but it was. So these are the points I wanted to make. Thank you. Thank you for allowing me, sir.
Okay. Professor Devi?
Yeah, very briefly. Is there a bridge language for the Union of Europe? There isn't. I mean, they use French, German, Spanish, and English. They have 64 languages within Europe, but they use 4 or 5 as bridge languages.
So,
In India, we have done, before the English arrived to India, was this subcontinent a culturally connected continent or not? It was. Hindi started growing as a language in the 16th century, and the first printed book in Hindi dates back to 1804. It was printed in Calcutta by a man called Lalluji Lal in the government printing press. But prior to that, Indians managed their affairs in the presence of so many languages. I mean, you think of Shankaracharya going to the Adi Shankara, going from Kerala to Himalayas. What was the bridge language that he used? Actually, absence of a bridge language might bring people together. Having a convenient bridge might set people apart. Please consider the one idea of nationalism is a nation must have a single language. Some nations also believe that they must have a single religion. But that is a 19th century European idea which grew up in Germany and in Italy. But for a democracy which took birth in the middle of the 20th century and is moving to the 21st century, we'll have to think differently. So please reconsider the idea that there is a need for a bridge language. Human beings manage their affairs without a single bridge language quite beautifully because they're linguistically they are very inventive. Semiotically, they're very inventive. But time is running out, and we'll have this conversation at another time. All that I want to say at the end of this session is, as was requested by Dr. Air Marshal Mathesaran, that I'm absolutely delighted that he decided to dedicate this evening to the memory of Jawaharlal Nehru. I want to thank you for doing that, because in this country, one thing that we need to remember is not so much Ram, but we need to remember Jawaharlal Nehru, who built institutions, democratic institutions, and who understood the multiple cultural character of India as rarely any other political leader in the country understood. So thank you very much. And thank you for giving this time to me. Thank you indeed.
Thank you, Professor Devi. That was excellent. And I think we were honored. We are absolutely honored to have had your, exposition this evening, both on for the Peninsula Foundation and on for the South Forum. Let me invite Professor Kalam to give the concluding remarks for this evening. Professor Kalam.
Thank you, Dr. Matheswaran, and it's a great pleasure for me that I will be concluding some of the things, but then conclude only for the evening. The debate will go on.
Yes, of course.
Debate about scripts and languages, and debates about what's the script and what's the dialect. I think that's not an ending one. I think the basic point would be that the languages will take care of themselves if the politicians do not interfere. I think that should be the ultimate kind of a thing which should happen. People should decide what they want to study, how they want to study, what script they want to adopt, and how they want to go about dispersing or using the language. So as long as the politicians do not interfere, most things will take care of themselves. Okay, and just by the way, let me just also point out that Urdu does not have a script. And in spite of efforts being made ferociously to put it down, they haven't succeeded. Urdu is growing outside the continent. In fact, the number of universities outside where Urdu is taught is happening, and Urdu takes a Perso-Arabic or Arabic-Perso script. It does not have a script of its own because it's developed as a Lashkari language when the Mughals were there, and they brought Farsi with them, and they brought Arabic with them, and with some words from Sanskrit, it developed as a local language which was there. So it doesn't have a script, doesn't matter. English, as was pointed out, doesn't have a script. Whole lot of languages do not have a script. And I think Professor Vijay Kumar wrote on the chat saying that Konkani does not have a script. It takes either English or Marathi or even Kannada sometimes. And the Kodagu language, for instance, that does not have a script. Now, having said that, the other example which Professor Devi was giving was something very significant for those of us who are not familiar with the northeast of India and have lived there for about 4 years. Nagaland has got 16 officially recognized Naga groups. The Sema Nagas, the Angami, the Ao, the Lota, the Konyak, and so many others, totally coming to 16 officially recognized ethnic groups. And when they speak to each other, they don't understand. All 16 are distinct languages. In fact, if somebody speaks Tamil and Malayalam, you know there are a lot of common words. Between the 16 Naga languages, there's very, very little commonality. And therefore, Professor Devi alluded to this, they have developed what is known as Nagamis. Nagamis is something which uses a lot of Naga words from these different languages which are there, plus Assamese. And probably English is very common in most urban areas. And one of the other things I would like to point out, since we are on Nagaland, is these 16 groups come together on the 1st of December till the 10th of December every year for the Hornbill Festival at a village which is developed for the purpose called the Kisama village. Now, this is about 10-15 kilometers from Kohima, the capital. And every year, all of them come together and have this beautiful kind of a festival which goes on for and the motif or the metaphor that they're using is the hornbill, the bird, Hornbill Festival. So given this, I think they still have the kind of commonality which comes in spite of the kind of diversity which is there among them. And outside Nagaland, the official boundaries of Nagaland on the Assamese border and Manipur border, they also have other Naga groups who are not within Nagaland officially recognized. So that's something I think we need to know when it comes to the Northeast. And Northeast, I'm just giving one single example. Arunachal Pradesh, Meghalaya, Tripura, Manipur, all of them show so much of diversity within them. But then people have a lot of knowledge about overseas. They know very little about what's happening in the Northeast. So thank you, Professor Devi, for taking up this responsibility of delivering this. We've actually wanted to have it on the 14th of November, but that's going to be Diwali. And just before that and after that, probably it would not have been appropriate. Therefore, we decided that we will have this lecture on the 7th. And I also thank Professor Kalyan Kumar Chakravarti for joining us and illuminating some of the points which are required given his vast experience which is there. And I also thank all the people who have joined this evening, taking time off so that we could have a kind of a discourse coming from scholars. And it's been a very rich kind of an experience because not just the two speakers who were there, Professor Devi and Dr. Chakravarti, but the others have added to this. And I do hope in future when we have these kind of things, these kind of meetings which will be organized, more people will join, and it's been great. And if some of the questions have not been taken up, we ask you for apologies because not everything could be taken up. And some of the things which were highlighted are quite important. But I'm sure there are a lot of things which people will go home with from the lecture which was there. And having been a member or part of both the South Forum as well as the Peninsula Foundation, I think it was a good initiative, and we will have further initiatives of this kind coming up later. And thank you all for joining, and please look forward to the next exercise that we'll be doing. Thank you very much. Good evening, good night to all of you. And the rest of the day, wherever you are, have a nice time and stay safe. Thank you.
Thank you all, and have a great weekend. Thank you so much. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Good night.
Good night. Good night, everyone. Good night, Professor Devi.
Good night to all our friends and colleagues.
Yeah, good night to you all.
Good night.
Bye.